Beyond the Hype, a fashion lifestyle tech podcast. Presented by Stephanie Williams and Greg Lewis.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that has, well, pretty huge global implications. The Paris Agreement. Specifically, we're going to be talking about what a potential U.S. withdrawal could mean for, tackling climate change. And we'll be focusing specifically on the fashion industry today. Are you with me?
The Paris Agreement is interesting because it's not just a few countries, it's practically every single nation on Earth coming together with this common goal. And that goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels.
Okay, so that's the big picture. But things are getting, well, kind of interesting right now. There's a potential shift in U.S. policy happening that could really shake things up. We're talking about the possibility of a major global power and emitter stepping back from this landmark agreement.
Right, and it's important to understand how the agreement works. It's built on these things called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs for short. Basically, each country comes up with its own plan for how they're going to reduce their emissions.
So it's kind of like a global potluck where everyone brings their own dish, but everyone's working towards that same goal.
Yeah.
A sustainable climate.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of dishes at this potluck, the fashion industry has a pretty big one, right?
Absolutely. The fashion industry has a massive carbon footprint. It's actually one of the top polluting industries globally. There are serious concerns about their water usage, textile waste, and the amount of emissions just from production and transportation.
It's almost like fast fashion is sprinting in the opposite direction of the marathon we need to be running to combat climate change, huh?
That's a great way to put it. That's where a company like MOJOMOTO comes in. They're using these digital solutions to try to make the fashion industry more sustainable.
Yeah, I've been wanting to learn more about them. It sounds like they're really doing some fascinating work, all to try and reduce waste and emissions.
They're definitely leading the way with innovation in this space.
And we are lucky enough to have Lars Rahbaek from MOJOMOTO joining us today. Welcome to the show, Lars.
Thank you, Greg and Stephanie.
Your perspective is, well, especially valuable right now, given this potential shift in U.S. policy.
As we mentioned, the newly elected U.S. president has expressed some skepticism about climate change and the Paris Agreement.
And he actually withdrew the U.S. from the agreement during his first term. Even though the country did rejoin under the subsequent administration, his election definitely raises questions about the future of U.S. participation in the agreement. It creates a lot of uncertainty, that's for sure.
Lars, what kind of impact do you think a potential U.S. withdrawal could have on sustainability efforts within the fashion industry? Do you think it might lead to some unexpected positive changes, particularly for European companies? We know that Europe has really been at the forefront of pushing for climate action. So could a U.S. exit from the Paris Agreement actually create this leapfrog effect where European companies and consumers who are already, pretty committed to sustainability actually double down on their efforts because of this?
So almost like if they're not going to do it, we will kind of mentality.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We're already seeing that shift happening in Europe. Consumers are more and more demanding these sustainable options, and brands are starting to realize that it's not just good for the planet, it's good for business too.
So you're saying even if the U.S. takes a step back, the momentum in Europe is strong enough to keep things moving forward?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, a U.S. withdrawal could even speed things up. If the U.S. isn't setting the pace anymore, it leaves this open space for leadership on the global stage. And Europe, with its strong environmental policies and all these innovative companies they have, is in a great position to fill that gap.
That's really interesting. It almost flips the script.
Instead of the U.S. leading the way, Europe could become the trendsetter, showing the world that a sustainable fashion industry isn't just a dream, it's the future.
So instead of a setback, this could actually be a catalyst for even more innovation and progress, particularly in Europe.
Exactly. It creates the space for companies like MOJOMOTO to really showcase what's possible. We can demonstrate that you can have a thriving fashion industry that's also environmentally responsible.
Lars, I'm loving your optimism here. You're seeing this potential policy shift not as a roadblock, but as a chance to push even harder for the change you believe in.
I think what Lars is saying is really important. Every challenge can be reframed as an opportunity. In this case, the opportunity is to prove that sustainability isn't about choosing between profits and the planet. It's about creating a fashion industry that thrives by respecting both.
That's inspiring to hear, Lars. But let's get down to the details. What does all this mean for MOJOMOTO specifically? How do you see your company navigating this potentially shifting landscape?
Well, for MOJOMOTO, our core mission stays the same: to help the fashion industry become more sustainable through digital solutions. That doesn't depend on what any single country decides to do. What might change is how urgent and how big our work becomes.
Meaning,
if the U.S. does withdraw from the Paris Agreement, the focus on sustainable practices is going to intensify. Companies, especially in Europe, will be looking for solutions, and they'll need them fast. That's where MOJOMOTO comes in. We give them the tools and technology they need to reduce their environmental impact and meet those global sustainability goals.
so you're almost like the go-to resource for fashion companies who want to stay ahead of the curve no matter what's happening politically.
Yeah, you could say that we're not just about compliance, we're about leadership. We're about showing the world that a sustainable fashion industry isn't just possible, it's the future.
I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different perspectives on this whole issue. The potential U.S. withdrawal is complex, and there are valid concerns about what it could mean for global climate action.
Absolutely. We need to be balanced in our view. While there's reason to be optimistic about the potential for positive change, we can't downplay how serious the climate challenge is and how important global cooperation is.
And speaking of the bigger picture, it's important to remember that the Paris Agreement isn't solely dependent on the U.S. The agreement represents a global consensus on how urgent climate action is.
Exactly. It's a landmark achievement, bringing together almost every single nation on Earth in a shared commitment to address climate change. And while the U.S. is a big player, the actions of other countries, businesses, and individuals are also incredibly important.
It's like this global movement that's gaining momentum.
Consumers are more aware of their choices, investors are looking for sustainable businesses, and governments around the world are putting policies in place to help transition to a low-carbon economy.
Yeah, it's this multifaceted shift happening on so many levels. Even without the U.S. leading the way, the transition towards a more sustainable future is already in motion. The question is, how quickly and how effectively can we make that transition happen?
Okay, so we've talked about the potential impact on the fashion industry, the role of companies like MOJOMOTO, and the wider global context. But what does all this mean for our listeners? Why should they care about any of this?
That's a great question. I think it comes down to this.
The choices we make both individually and as a society really do matter. Whether it's the clothes we buy, the companies we support, or the policies we advocate for, we all have a part to play in creating a more sustainable future.
It's about understanding that our actions have consequences, and those consequences reach far beyond ourselves.
Exactly. Climate change is a global challenge that needs a global response. And that response starts with each one of us.
So true. And Lars's perspective is so valuable here. He's reminding us that even when things are uncertain, there's still room for hope and for taking action.
Absolutely. It's about focusing on what we can control, being a part of the solution, and having faith that a better future is possible.
It's inspiring, to say the least. Lars, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. Your work with MOJOMOTO is truly making a difference.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Paris Agreement and what it could mean for the future of fashion, I want to leave you with something to think about. Imagine you're in charge of a fashion company right now. You're steering the ship through all this uncertainty. Would you see a potential U.S. withdrawal as a step backward? Or would you, like Lars, see it as a chance to really lead the charge toward a more sustainable future?
That's a really great question. It's something we should all be thinking about. The world is watching, and the choices these businesses make, especially in a powerful industry like fashion, will have a big impact.
And it's not just about those big companies either. This is about all of us. Every time we buy something, we're making a choice about what kind of world we want to live in.
Yeah, so choose wisely. Choose sustainably. Let's work together to create a future where fashion and the planet can both thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep making those conscious choices.
Beyond the Hype, a fashion lifestyle tech podcast.